Thank you to all the parents and the caregivers joining us. My name is Tim Allen. I'm the Care.com CEO. Care is committed to providing tools, education, resources to parents and caregivers while you're caring for all you love. That's our commitment to the world. This event has over 5,000 attendees, so there's going to be no shortage of questions, no shortage of information sharing, and our intent is you walk away with a lot of value. So let me introduce Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. Dr. Tatum is the president emeriti at Spelman College. She's an award-winning psychologist. She's widely known for all of her work. She's the author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, which last I saw it was number 6 on the New York Times bestselling print and nonfiction book. Congratulations, Dr. Tatum. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, no problem. And she has another book called Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation. So Dr. Tatum, thank you. And thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Appreciate it. So jumping right in, parents in America are now having conversations that have long been either ignored or avoided or have been very uncomfortable. You have been having these conversations for years. In fact, your book came out in 1997, right? So how do we as parents start really having the conversations and taking the actions so that our children aren't having to have the same conversations with their children in 23 years?
Sure. Well, let me start out by saying that children will ask questions starting at a very early age. So many people will ask, well, when do kids notice difference? Babies notice difference. 6-month-olds notice difference. But by the time children have language, 2-year-olds are able to have a conversation with you and ask questions. Why does that person look so dark? Why is that person's hair like that? These are the kinds of questions, particularly that white children are likely to ask when they encounter a Black person or a dark-skinned person, maybe in a grocery store or someplace else. And parents may respond with the well-known shh when such a question gets asked, maybe because if it's been asked in public, they're embarrassed. But in fact, being able to answer a child's question about difference is very helpful because they do notice they're not blind, as we sometimes like to describe kids as colorblind. They don't. They do notice, but if they are a lot, they realize they're not supposed to mention or talk about the differences they notice. And we leave them with a lot of confusion if we don't answer those questions.
Would your advice be to be straight to the point, but keep it age appropriate for the child? As you've talked about, developmental cycles are different with kids at different ages. So how do you recommend approaching the conversation directly with kids at different spectrums?
Well, let me start by saying that when we are talking to children about racial difference, again, all these conversations should be age appropriate. And one way to have an age appropriate conversation, particularly with a toddler or a preschooler, is to use books, right? There are lots of age appropriate children's books that have images or talk about physical difference. And when we talk about, different skin color or different eye shape or different hair texture, we are helping children understand the wider world. And we're helping them understand it in a way that is positive and affirming for all the different children who are being depicted if we have chosen our books wisely. But having said that, those conversations are different than the conversations about racism. Racism is about unfairness. And a lot of parents might say, well, my 3-year-old, my 4-year-old, my 5-year-old is too young to have a conversation about racism. But in fact, they're not too young if we are talking about it relative to fair and unfair. You can have a conversation with a 3 or 4-year-old about what it means to treat somebody unfairly. If I gave Tommy 2 cookies every afternoon and only gave you 1, would that be fair? It would not. Sometimes in our society, people are treated differently because of the way they look. Some people are given more good things and less punishment, and other people are given more punishment and fewer good things simply because of the way they look. That's a 3 or 4-year-old conversation. And you can say, and that's very unfair. Those conversations might come up because of what's happening in the news or perhaps because of a question a child asked. And so following the child's lead by listening carefully to the questions they ask can take you a long way toward having those conversations.
That's great. That's great. And you're talking in regards to the insular conversations of parents to children. How do we ensure, especially as a white father, right? How do I ensure my school is supporting that, or the teachers or the other people who are interacting in my child's life are supporting those messages, and also being consistent in giving the message of racism as fair, unfair, but also here's what differences represent?
Yes. So parents of all backgrounds should feel free and empowered to ask questions of the caregivers. One of the things that I'd like to tell parents to do is, first of all, look around and see what you see in the building, in the school. You know, who are the caregivers? Who are the children? Are there groups of children missing? You know, is it an all white environment? Is it diverse? Are the staff diverse? And what's up on the walls? What are the posters? What are the books? What's in the play corner? These are questions that any parent can ask, because every parent should want their child to be growing up understanding that they live in a diverse world. So just by asking, you know, who's missing from the picture here, is one way to start a conversation. Another way is to ask the educators, the caregivers, how are you talking about difference with children? What crayons are available? If kids are spending time coloring, do we have a set of crayons that represents all skin tones, for example? These are the kinds of questions that any parent can ask, but I think they're especially important if you want to see your own child represented, and that's a bigger task for the parent of color often, because their children are the ones who are less likely to see their skin color represented, or their, you know, their family group represented in the stories or the resources available. But every parent should think it's important.
Ah, that's great. It's the implicit signals, right? Children pick up on, from the crayons through the messaging on the walls you're talking about. For Black parents, where there may not be a large body of Black students, what can they do to have the conversations to show that there's modeling outside of themselves, right? There's role modeling, there's emulation available. What are the things that Black parents could also do in order to ensure that they're getting the full spectrum exposure? So that way it's not just, you know, a one segmented school, especially with hyper segregation occurring. So
Sure. Well, if we talk about the experiences of Black families living in predominantly white communities, one of the challenges, and this happens to be another area of my research, one of the challenges that Black families in those communities have is finding other kids of color for their children to be friends with. You know, their child might be the only child of color in the classroom or in the neighborhood. And while you certainly want your children to have friends of all backgrounds, there is something important for children to see them, people like themselves represented. So parents who are raising children in that environment will often tell me in the interviews that I've had with them that they seek out opportunities. Maybe it's driving to a church, a town or two over where there's a larger Black population. Or maybe it's making sure that they stay connected to cousins and relatives who will share and reflect their background, so that their kids have some opportunity to see themselves reflected, not just in a book or on a video, because that's a hard position to be in, to be one of few.
yeah.
But if you're a white parent and your situation is that you're living in a largely white environment where there are very few children of color for your children to befriend, then your task is to think about, how do I expand my child's experience so they don't just grow up in this very homogeneous bubble. One of the things I tell educators when I'm having those opportunities to do professional development is that all of our kids need to know how to live and learn how to live in a multicultural, multiracial environment. The 21st century is very diverse. And if we don't have those skills as young people, we are in essence causing our children to be what I call social dinosaurs, not ready for the climate in which they're going to be living.
I love that, social dinosaurs. Wow, that's wow. You have a stat in the book that blew me away, where a study was performed that 75% of white parents have social networks that are fully white. And it's not even intentional in all regards. Like sometimes it's intentional, but like there's also just this implicit normal gravitation towards homogeneous state that we have to disrupt as parents and really stand and say, I'm going to consciously do something about this.
Yes. So I think it is absolutely necessary to think about, how do I expand my social network? One of the things we know is that if an adult has a multiracial group of friends, their children will have a multiracial group of friends, right? Because the friends have children, and the social, but the parent is also modeling, that I embrace and celebrate the diversity in our community, and I am connected to people from all backgrounds. And when that's true, then it's a natural thing for children to learn how to do that as well. The parent who says, well, I don't have any friends of color, how do I make friends of color? The best way perhaps would be to think about, what are your interests? Do you like to sing? Are you in a community choir? There are gospel choirs you could join. Are there international clubs that you could be a part of? Is there a book club connected to the local library that might bring you into contact with people who are different from yourself? It might mean extending beyond your usual comfort zone, but that is part of how it gets done.
I love it. It's great. There was another moment I had reading your book, this aha moment of where you use the analogy of the airport walkway to talk not just about how you shouldn't be racist, right? There's the racist, reactive racism, but anti-racism. And that's something parents are really trying to have the conversation with their kids about and invoke and enroll. Do you mind sharing that analogy with everyone? And so,
yeah. So I think it's really important when we think about understanding racism, that racism is not just prejudice. It's not just negative attitudes about a particular person or set of people. It's about policies and practices and institutional contexts that really form a system. And that system was in place before I was born, before you were born. It has been operating in our country a long time, really baked in to our cultural context. And so if we think about it as like a conveyor belt, that we sort of step onto from at birth, we step onto this conveyor belt and we're growing up, and the conveyor belt is carrying us along, like the automatic sidewalk, the automatic walkway at the airport. Yeah. What we can say is that that conveyor belt of racism that's carrying all of us along can be interrupted, but there's some people who are walking. If you've been on that walkway at the airport, there's some people who like to walk fast to their destination.
That's right.
And there are other people who like to stand still, right? And if there are people who are walking fast, we might think of those people relative to racism as the active racists, the people who are embracing white supremacy, embracing the racial ideology that has underlied the racism in our society, and they're really going for it, right? Then there are a lot of people who don't want to go where they're going, but they are just standing still. And they would say, I'm not racist because I'm not following those people, right? I'm not going there. But they're still being carried along by that same conveyor belt. They're just not actively being carried along. Yeah. And then there are people who will say, I see where that walkway is headed. I don't want to go there. So I'm going to turn around. I'm going to be not racist. I'm turning around. I'm not even looking. But now, unless they're moving, they're just traveling backwards, right? They're still being carried along, but they don't see where they're going. That some people might describe that as being passively anti-racist. But what I would say is that there's no such thing as being not racist or passively anti-racist, because the only way to interrupt that process is to actively walk in the opposite direction. You have to be moving faster than that conveyor belt to really interrupt being carried along. So when we talk about, when people hear that term anti-racist, what that is saying is we have to be working against those systems. We have to interrupt those policies and practices. We have to create new systems that are equitable and that don't reinforce a racial hierarchy in our society.
Got it. That's great. I really appreciate it. It was such an impactful moment reading that, because it also then spawned the questions for myself as a parent, as a voice of one in the world of parenting, of am I doing enough to move against the walkway, right? Am I walking fast enough that the walkway is not inherently just taking me along with it?
Right.
That was really great. So thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate that. There's a topic out there today that's complex and really packs in a lot of different emotions and values, which is kids are taught at an early age that police are going to protect them, right? And if they're ever in danger, to call the police. There's a different conversation in Black families about what happens, especially with adolescents or as you grow older, about how to interact with the police, right? That white parents don't have to have. Plus, you layer on top of that all of the images that have been happening in the news, and you've got a lot of different messages that Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. How do you unpack this for kids and explain it to them in a way that they understand and can process all of this complex information and messaging?
Well, it is complex. I mean, as you have illustrated, there are adults who are not clear on some of these topics, but to the extent that we are trying to help children understand, for example, the recent events following the murder of George Floyd. Many young children will not have seen that video, and we would hope that would be the case. You don't want kids to see something traumatic like that if you can prevent it, particularly young children. But if a child has been inadvertently exposed, saw something on TV or on a computer screen, and has questions about it, you certainly want to talk about those questions. And even if you're not talking about that specific incident, but if you're talking about why are people protesting, you can talk about the fact that people are protesting because some bad things have happened, particularly to Black people. Some bad things have happened when police officers made mistakes. And one mistake that happened was this police officer knelt on, I wouldn't even get into the specifics. I would say a police officer hurt someone very badly. And that was unfair. And sometimes that happens more frequently. We know in our society that those bad things happen more frequently to Black people at the hands of police than they do to white people. It's not fair, but it's a fact. And so we are working to make sure it stops happening that way. I think the emphasis on working to change is an important message for children. It will be reassuring to them to hear that not just that bad things happened, because bad things did happen, but that people are working to change those bad things. One question that might come up, though it's important to say, is a young child might say, well, that happened to me. Or could that happen to you? Maybe I'm worried that that's going to happen to my dad, or it's going to happen to me. Particularly Black children might have that concern. And if that were being expressed, or even if it wasn't, I think a parent can say with some reassurance, particularly to a young child, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, I'm here to protect you. I'm going to make sure that those things don't happen. Now, if your child is 14 or 15, you can't say that with the same confidence, because that 14 or 15-year-old is spending time away from you, out riding his or her bike, maybe starting to learn to drive, depending on the age of driving in your state. And so if children are spending time outside of your protective bubble, then what you have to say, Black parents have to say to their children, here's what you need to know to be safe. I hope this never happens to you. We know that there are lots of police officers who are truly trying to protect people, but we also know that sometimes bad things happen. And here's what you need to do to ensure that it's less likely to happen to you.
It's great.
It's a tough conversation, there's no question. But if you don't have it, you leave your child quite vulnerable.
Right. They develop their own conversation, right? In the absence of having a direct conversation with a parent. I 100% get it. Shifting from parents to child relationship and to the parent to parent dynamic, or the caregiver to parent dynamic, what do you recommend for parents in regards to interacting with other parents, or parents interacting with caregivers, or caregivers interacting with parents, where they aren't necessarily doing the work, or perhaps even have some belief structures that could be considered racist, or could be considered not in alignment with what you want for your children?
So one parent talking to another parent who's expressing a point of view, maybe that you don't share, maybe expressing prejudicial attitudes, or maybe just talking about, I want my children to be colorblind, and maybe you as a parent have come to understand that that's not helpful.
Right.
And so you want to talk to that parent about it. I often recommend what I call the 3F strategy. F, F, F. And if you're wondering what those F stand for, it's felt, found, and feel. So let's imagine we're having that conversation. You might say something like, I felt that way. There was a time when I felt that the most important thing was that for my children to, quote, not see color. But then I found out that actually children do see color. They just learn not to talk about it. And that what we really want them to know is that it's not right to discriminate against someone on the basis of their color. But there's nothing wrong with the color. There's nothing wrong with the diversity in our world. And I want my children to appreciate those differences. So now I feel it's important for me to talk about not only that we recognize those differences, but we also recognize that we have to work against racism to prevent people from being mistreated on the basis of those differences.
That's great. That's great. It's an important conversation also with parents, with caregivers, right? Because
Yes.
caregivers are coming into your home and taking care of your children, or even in your daycare or your childcare center, and they spend a healthy amount of time with that child, influencing the child. You want to make sure that there's an alignment there and that you're having these direct conversations. Yeah, completely got it. That's so great. You tell the story, and I've heard it a number of times because it's such a great story about your son, Jonathan, and his friend telling him that the reason his skin is dark is he drank too much chocolate milk. Do you mind sharing that story with the parents, and then also the lessons that you were able to share with Jonathan through that story?
Sure. Well, let me just say, because it's, I'm going to give you the short version of the story, but there's also a TEDx talk of the same title that parents can find on YouTube. But it goes back to when my son, who's now all grown up, was then 3. And he came home, I picked him up from his childcare center, and he asked me, Mom, Tommy says my skin is brown because I drink chocolate milk. Is that true? And of course, it's not true. And I said that. I said, no, Jonathan, it's not true. Your skin is brown because you have something in your skin called melanin. Everybody has some. And in fact, it's a good thing to have because it helps protect your skin from the sun. But the more you have, the browner your skin is. Even Tommy has some. We talked about that too. But I said, at your school, you are the kid with the most. And that's why your skin is the brownest. And so he liked my explanation, which also happens to be accurate. And he liked the fact that he was the kid with the most of something. But I was concerned about Tommy, as in who was straightening Tommy out, who was answering Tommy's question. And it was that experience, that conversation I had with Jonathan, that the next day prompted me to go to the school and ask the teachers, I'm wondering, how are you talking about difference? As it happened, Jonathan was the only Black child in his class. And so I wondered what kinds of conversations the children were having and the teachers were having with the children. And the teacher I spoke with said, it hasn't come up. But of course it had come up, but maybe it had come up in the dress up corner or someplace out of earshot, where the kids were talking to each other and maybe the teacher didn't hear the conversation. But it also made me wonder whether we sometimes have what I'm going to call selective attention. We don't pay attention to the things that make us uncomfortable. If I don't notice that conversation, I won't have to figure out what to say. And so let me just tune into something else. But in fact, kids are having these conversations. They need information. And I think it's also important to say that Tommy was not being mean or biased in his question. Though I will say, when he said too much chocolate milk, that sort of implies that, you're doing something wrong, right?
Right.
If you didn't, that you wouldn't have this brown skin if you weren't drinking too much chocolate milk. Which suggests that Tommy was already sensing that it was better to have lighter skin. That's sort of implied in his question, the way he phrased it. But even if it had just been a straight up, you are what you eat, and you're drinking chocolate milk, and I think that's why, your skin is brown. It wasn't intended to be hurtful. Yeah. And I don't think Jonathan was hurt, but he was puzzled, when he came home. And I think that it's important for us to answer children's questions so that they don't carry around misperceptions.
Yeah. I always say to myself, kids have the purest expression of what's starting to formulate, right? Like they'll ask the purest questions, they'll make the purest statements. And sometimes as parents, we can conflate intent on top of that. And that's our conversation, right? When they just don't understand, or they've had experiences that have exposed them to having a train of thought or thinking, right? So it's the too much really, yeah.
Yeah, I do want to add, though, it is important to say that even young children, 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, can express prejudices. That, I don't think that was what was Tommy's motive in that conversation, but you can hear a 3-year-old say, you can't play with us because you are fill in the blank, right? You can hear kids exclude and express prejudicial attitudes, particularly if they are in an environment where those attitudes are being expressed by the adults around them. So I think in my book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, one of the things I talk about in the chapter on young children is that the smog that we are breathing, the smog of stereotypes, the smog of prejudicial attitudes is around us all the time. And we should not assume that kids don't pick those things up. They do, and they start to pick them up at a very early age.
Yeah. You also talk about how in media they pick it up as well. Like what impacted me is, and maybe it was relevant, my children had just watched Peter Pan, right? And Peter Pan was a good example of how that is an implicit stereotype of that generation and that time of Native Americans, right? So you talk about how media can reinforce or start to formulate and educate our children implicitly through this. So yeah, it really like powerful, like really great. Talking to the parents who have adolescents and teens, and maybe not even adolescents and teens, I'd love to hear your higher level thinking than mine on this, which is microaggressions. Like microaggressions start to formulate, right? And microaggressions, you say in isolation can seem trivial, but compounded really start to create a narrative in children's minds. Do you mind talking about what microaggressions are for the parents who don't know what that is, and what we can do to really ensure we're disrupting those within our kids from early ages and also adolescence?
Sure. So microaggressions can be, they're defined as slights, small insults. It's not the racial slur or the active, intentional hurt, but they are the kind of daily interactions that can cause discomfort. And it's because they are so frequent and you don't know when they're going to occur that they can keep you in a state of stress. This is why microaggressions have been shown to contribute to high blood pressure and, general psychological distress for people who are referred to, experience them frequently. I'm going to give a common one that perhaps like a multiracial child might experience. Can I touch your hair? Right? Or what are you? People will ask if someone appears racially ambiguous. Well, having someone constantly ask you, what are you? That's a microaggression. Asking someone to, sort of touch you like you're in a petting zoo, that's a microaggression. Asian Americans sometimes experience microaggressions when people ask, where are you from? Well, I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma. No, really, where are you from? And what they mean is, what is your ancestry? Or someone who, again, this is an example for that Asian Americans often report, you speak English so well. Where did you learn to speak so well? Yeah. Because people assume that the face is a foreign face,
Mm.
and doesn't necessarily match what they're thinking of as someone who is, quote, American, a real American, so to speak. Those are just two small examples. A common one that Black people experience is when someone says, "Oh, you're so articulate."
Yeah.
You know, that is intended to be a compliment, but implied is the assumption that you wouldn't be, you know, that you would not be able to speak in a particular way. You know, I've had experiences of, this is a long time ago, but it speaks to, you know, sort of the microaggression, being in a grocery store in California when my husband and I lived there, having, in a largely white community, having a white woman come up and ask me if I could help her pick out a watermelon. You know, that is, you know, like, well, why do you think I would be particularly expert at that?
Right.
Not so much, you know what I mean? Those
Yeah,
are,
no.
you know, and I could recognize the stereotype, and I'm sure the person didn't mean it as an insult in any way, you know,
Right.
just looking for some help in the grocery store. But
Yeah.
those are the kinds of things that we might describe as microaggressions.
Wow. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. You know, I've been doing a lot of listening and talking, and I had a friend who I've known for years say to me, who's in a second year at a prestigious law school and wears his sweatshirt around, and he goes, you know, he will walk into a restaurant or a bar and they'll go, "Oh, do you want to go to law school?" And he's Black, right? And so he goes, "No, I'm in law school," right? Like, you know, I understand, like, that's a microaggression. Like, there's a belief structure, like, oh, you know, that's not for the Black individual. Like, it's very just, it's subversive, right? It's like very, and not maybe not intentional, but very subversive. So thank you for sharing that. I think that that's really like illuminating. So one of the questions from our parents was, you know, they have a son who's 10 and is struggling to understand because they don't subscribe to being colorblind. They're having these active conversations, but they don't understand that their child doesn't understand why Black people are being treated unfairly, right? And they go to slavery was ended, right? Like, it's just, they don't understand all of the other unpacked aspects of it. Do you mind sharing just part of a conversation to have with a teenager or someone who's grappling with that inside of their school?
Sure. Well, one of the things that question reflects to me is a lack of historical knowledge, right? So if someone thinks that, you know, slavery ended and then it was over, they have obviously missed what happened during Reconstruction and following Reconstruction, the implementation of what were referred to as the Black Codes, Jim Crow in the South, you know, the continuing segregation as people migrated from the South to the North, the redlining of communities. I mean, there's so much information that is absent. You know, anyone who says slavery was 400 years ago, why are we still talking about this, has missed about 400 years of history. And so the good news is there are resources. If you don't know that history, there are videos you can watch. There are books intended for young adults that you can read. And so the gap can be filled in, and parents and children can fill in that historical knowledge gap together, and talk about, you know, we really need to understand why these things are still occurring, why they never stopped. They just took different forms. And so, you know, I remember when my children were much younger. We're in different generations here, but you know, when the documentary Eyes on the Prize about the civil rights movement was on PBS, and watching that with them. And of course, those documentaries are still available and can be found online, you know, various streaming services provide them. But there are lots of ways to fill in those gaps, but that's, I think, what a question like that requires, some additional historical information.
No, appreciate that. Gap exists. I think some parents may take the solace in, oh, the school should be educating them. And I think you have to ensure that, you know, what the school's educating them, right? Taking a look in that aspect and filling in those gaps, to your point. I think that's so important. Yes. I think it's great. That's great. I really appreciate that advice. And it hits home with me too, right? You have to do the work, and you have to keep doing the work. And that's great. Another question came in from a parent, and she's Black with Caribbean heritage. She has 2 children, 8 and 6. And she's had conversations with the older child, the 8-year-old child, but the 6-year-old child, she hasn't quite exposed. So there's a differential in the conversation really happening
Sure.
to right? Do you encourage families to have the conversation together? Do you encourage families to and you've always said be age consistent and age appropriate, but when you start to have kids that are closer in age, do you recommend having those conversations together as a family? Like, would you mind giving me a little bit of advice on that?
Yeah. Well, in this particular case, and parents are going to know their own children better than, any person. So I'm going to give advice saying, use your own judgment here. But I could imagine with a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old that there are books you might be able to read together. For example, I'm just going to use as an example, there's a wonderful book called Something Happened in Our Town, which is about a shooting of a Black person by a police officer, written by 3 psychologists. And it is described as being intended for children between the ages of 4 and 8. So a parent might get that book, Something Happened in Our Town, and sit and read the book together with the 6-year-old and the 8-year-old. The 8-year-old might ask more sophisticated questions than the 6-year-old, but it would be possible to have a dialogue about that issue jointly. Now, let's imagine those children were 4 and 6. Again, the 4-year-old would be on the young end of that, but if they're 2 and 4, probably that's not going to work, right? Or 8 and 10, the 10-year-old is going to be ready for some things that they could read perhaps on their own that maybe the 8-year-old doesn't have the reading level yet for. So that 2-year gap is going to vary depending on, where children are developmentally. The difference between a 6 and 8-year-old, not that big. Between an 8 and 10-year-old, maybe bigger.
Yeah. Resource appropriate, right? Find the resources that are
Yes.
appropriate to that age group, have those conversations.
Yes.
I wanted to say, as I've been thinking about it, you've put a number of resources out there, the PBS documentary, books. We are going to compile that list, put it on our Twitter so everyone has access to that list. What I'd also say, is there any other resources you highly recommend for parents to seek out?
Yes, well, one of the places that I often refer people to is called socialjusticebooks.org, because they have curated lists of books and they're organized by topic and age appropriateness.
Great.
So, for a parent who's wondering what's the best topic on the civil rights movement for my 4-year-old, you can look that up and they've got a list of books that are organized around that age. But what about my young adult? What can I look for there? Another resource is Common Sense Media, which has also curated lists of books, but also documentaries, videos, other resources as well.
That's great. Really appreciate that. So we'll put that on the website as well. We'll put that out on Twitter, just so all of the parents who are attending and caregivers attending have access to all of the information that Dr. Tatum has graciously been sharing with us and educating us on. I mentioned at the beginning, at the top of this, you've been doing this for years, right? You've been having these conversations, you've been educating, talked about how the book came out 23 years ago, how in 23 years we're not having the same conversation.
Yes.
I just wanted to check in with you, like, where are your thoughts about the current moment? Do you feel like this is different? Do you feel like there is change? And how do we really instill that in our kids so that it is sustainable change, not just a momentary part of change?
Well, I think that it is a different moment in this sense. When I see the protests that have been happening around the country, one of the things that's striking to me is the significant presence of white people. And that is different. If I look back on other protests, even the civil rights era, there were certainly white people who were involved in the civil rights movement, and we know that. But in the level of the size of the crowds and the multiracial nature of the protest has been striking to me, which does suggest, and if, the polls that we hear about, that, something like 75 or 80% of people polled right now in, June 2020 are saying that they support the concept of Black Lives Matter or the Black Lives Matter movement. If we were having this conversation in September 2015 during the Ferguson uprisings, that was not the case.
Yeah.
So we do see a shift in attitudes, and certainly I think it is possible to build on the momentum that we're experiencing right now. But I think it's important to understand that it is not like flicking a light switch. It requires effort and commitment over a long period of time. So when we talk about sustainability, I think we have to talk to ourselves about our own sustained efforts, right? I have to make a sustained effort. You have to make a sustained effort. It's not going to just happen because we all decided it should.
Got it. Yeah, completely makes sense. Sustainability. Yeah, the sustained effort. That's exactly right. There was one topic that came up again and again in the parents' questions that I wanted to ask about, which is explaining white privilege, right? White privilege to your white children, right? And I'll speak from experience, having a number of these conversations. There's a lot of confusion with what privilege is, right? It can be conflated into, I didn't earn this, I didn't work hard, right? Do you mind unpacking? I know it's such a meaty topic, but do you mind taking a few moments and unpacking it and talking to us about how we could talk about white privilege with our children?
So I've been thinking about this conversation with a young child, and this is my analogy, and we're going to try this out. So first of all, we should understand that when people talk about privilege, what they're talking about are the benefits that come from an unfair system, right? So if we understand racism as a system of unfairness that is in place, giving benefits to one group of people and systematically disadvantaging another group of people, if we want to talk about the privilege, the concept of privilege are the benefits that come to that group that is receiving those benefits, right? So when we talk about white privilege, we're not talking about white ease. We're not talking about, white affluence. We're talking about the fact that you don't get followed around in the store when you go shopping. We're talking about the fact that if a police officer arrests you, he doesn't throw you on the ground and kneel on your neck. We're talking about the, another phrase that I've heard recently used is white immunity, that there are things that don't happen simply because you're white that regularly happen to people of color, particularly Black people in the context of anti-Black racism. So how would you talk about that to a young child? So here's an example that I think I would try out if I were having this conversation right now with a young child. And I would say, let's imagine you came home from school with your brother every day. And every day I gave him 2 cookies, and every day I only gave you 1. And you would think that was unfair, right? But we might say that he's got the privilege of getting 2 cookies, and you don't have that privilege. You're just getting 1. Now let's imagine that he came home from school before you, and I gave him his cookies before you got home. He might not know that you're only getting 1 cookie. He knows he's getting 2, but he doesn't know you're only getting 1 because he's not there to see it. Yeah. But if you came home and looked through the window and saw me giving him 2 cookies, and you were only getting 1, you would know you were getting the short end of the stick because you saw it. You saw him get the 2 cookies. He didn't see you get just 1, but you saw him get 2, right? And so you would feel like that was unfair. And let's imagine that he did something wrong. Let's imagine he broke some toys or, did something bad, and I punished him. But let's say you did something bad, but I gave you a worse punishment. Let's say you did the very same thing, and I made you clean up the mess and told you you couldn't have dessert tonight. But when he did it, I just told him to say sorry and go on about his business. I didn't make him clean up. He was being treated differently. You would think that was unfair. When we talk about racism, what we're talking about is a group of people getting more cookies, getting more benefits. They don't always know they're getting more, but they're getting more just because of the way the system operates. And we're also talking about sometimes getting more punishment, being treated differently by the police, even when they've done the same thing that somebody else might have done, being treated more harshly.
Wow. Wow. The cookie analogy, the looking through the window, it gets me. And now I'm like, now I want to run over to my 5-year-old and start having these conversations again. Thank you. That's incredible.
What I want to say, and I think that listeners will need to understand, that children, particularly young children, don't get abstract concepts, but they do get concrete experiences. They know that if you're giving out cookies, everybody should be getting the same. They understand that, right? They understand that. And so we have to translate these ideas into very concrete examples that they can understand.
Appreciate that. It's unbelievable to me, but we're out of time. Like, it's been 45 minutes. This has been an absolute pleasure. And I want to just say thank you. Thank you on behalf of all of the parents and all the caregivers. Thank you on behalf of myself and Care.com. And also just thank you for doing the work. Like, thank you for being there and being a voice through the years, especially not probably, when a lot of people weren't listening, right? And so thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor. And I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, Tim. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And for the parents who are watching or caregivers that are watching, there'll be a video recording of this. And we want to keep the conversation alive. This is not a topic that you could tackle in 45 minutes and answer all of the questions and help and get all the information. Please join us on our Twitter page. We will continue to answer questions. We'll continue to provide education and resources. And thank you for giving your time, and thank you for sharing your afternoon with us. So thank you, Dr. Tatum. Thank you to the parents and caregivers. Thank you so much.